Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and now it is time to sing. People try to put us down talking about my generation just because we get around talking about my generation. Things they do look awful cold talking about my generation. I hope I die before I get old talking about my generation. This is my generation. This is my generation, baby. And that was the song My Generation from The Who, 1965. And we're going to talk about that generation. We're going to talk about the boomers, and we're going to talk about Boomer America. And this will necessarily entail a discussion of generational history and a magic carpet, the Affluent Society, men in gray suits, and a baby boom. And as we do so, I strongly urge you to copy down that outline currently above my head to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we proceed to explore Boomer America. Now, in many ways, Boomer America comes from that, the Summer of Love, 1967. Starting around May of 1967, around 100,000 young people drifted into San Francisco, mostly to the neighborhood of Haight-Ashbury. They came for the impromptu music festivals, for the counterculture. They lived in parks, they lived in alleys, they slept in tents, or they slept in their cars. This was a conscious rejection of the stale, confining, conformist, war-loving America. And these people came for the celebration of life. They came for the celebration of love. They made fantastic music. They owned nothing. They smoked a lot of pot. They took odd jobs. They dropped acid. And this all started earlier in the year, earlier in 1967, with a celebration called the Human Be-In back in January. And all of these hippies began to spontaneously gather in San Francisco. They meditated. They tried to talk to God. They talked to nature. They hugged trees. They hugged each other. There was even a song that commemorated this incredible summer of love. Scott McKenzie's San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair from 1967. And I'll inflict my singing voice on you once more. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. If you're going to San Francisco, you're going to meet some gentle people there. For those who come to San Francisco, summertime will be a love in there. In the streets of San Francisco, gentle people with flowers in their hair. All across the nation, such a strange vibration, people in motion. There's a whole new generation with a whole new explanation. This was a whole new generation. The generation known as the Boomers, the children of the baby boom. This was the Summer of Love, 1967, in which Boomer America was conceived. And that's not all that was conceived in 1967. This was the era of the sexual revolution. Free love was in the air. This was the Summer of Love, 1967. And the music festivals of Woodstock in 1969. This was the peace movement, the hippies, the flower children, the age of Aquarius, whatever you want to call it. It was in these years that the movement reached its height, and it changed the country forever, largely creating the country we live in today. And the boomers grew up, and they remade the nation, and they grew old. The boomers created Boomer America. We live in the world they made. We live in Boomer America. And in their own telling of the story, the boomers took a stale and conformist America of the 1950s, a country oppressed and repressive, and they transformed it into a more caring and more peaceful and more liberated place. They launched a social revolution that changed America forever. But did it really happen that way? All right. In the last decade or so, the legacy of the boomers has come under intense criticism and not a little mockery, painting the baby boomers as out of touch, self-obsessed narcissists, hopeless in the 21st century. Not as a generation that peacefully transformed the country, but as a generation who trashed and impoverished the country and left an America much worse off than the America they inherited. I mean, look at the meme. The baby boom generation lost every war, voted in every corrupt politician, did all the drugs, trashed the economy, and left future generations drowning in debt. Blames millennials. And some of these memes and cartoons display quite a sharp wit. There's one on the left, the generation of 1900. We will make a better world for our children. The generation of World War II. We will make a better world for our children. The baby boomers. F you, entitled brats. And there's a cartoon right up above my head that shows two young people lugging around these giant weights called student loans, while a pair of retired boomers drive their golf cart around saying, "Haven't you young people have jobs yet? You have to pay for our Social Security." So there is a sharp and biting critique of the baby boomers. And this isn't just memes and cartoons. There have been scholarly works excoriating the boomers for the nation they created. There's Joseph Sternberg's Theft of a Decade, how the baby boomers stole the millennials' economic future. There's Bruce Gibney's very sharp A Generation of Sociopaths, how the baby boomers betrayed America. There's the old Christopher Hitchens article, Baby Boomer Wasteland. Pity the poor baby boomers. All they have to celebrate is their own mediocrity, selfishness, and hypocrisy. And you can find entire documentaries and podcasts all over the internet. How the baby boomers ruined society. And the boomers have, to some extent, made an effort to defend their legacy. You know, you see these books right up above me, Leonard Steinhorn's The Greater Generation, P.J. O'Rourke's The Baby Boom, How It Got That Way and It Wasn't My Fault and I'll Never Do It Again. Or articles like this, Does the Baby Boom Even Need to Redeem Itself? And as the baby boomers defend their historical legacy, to some extent the effort has been half-hearted, as mostly the baby boomers kind of just ignore all the criticism laid against them. But this is the historical debate that we'll be exploring here. We're going to open up a question about the baby boomers. We're going to answer that question on the left. Evaluate the historical legacy of the baby boomers. Are they social revolutionaries who made a better, more equal, more liberated America, or spoiled, self-indulgent narcissists who ruined the prosperous country they inherited? Using the history presented here from 1960 to the present, argue from one of these two perspectives, or another if you wish. Did the boomers save or squander the legacy of America? Now, this requires looking at history in a very particular way, in a way that we haven't looked at it so far. Not as the sequence of causes and effects, history not as the interplay between trends and institutions and individuals. We're specifically going to look at history here through the lens of generations. And in this formula, a generation is a people born during a distinct period of time, and so possess a shared collection of memories and experiences. And here is sort of the last 150 years of American history expressed as generations. The lost generation, the greatest generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, the millennials, and the Zoomers of today. So let's actually look at this. Let's actually look at how you look at history through a generational lens. Okay, so you have these different generations through time. And a generation, the people of this generation were born during very distinct years, and they collectively experienced historical events together, social customs, the popular culture of that time period. And so the people born during a certain period share a set of ideas and attitudes and beliefs and experiences. Now, the idea of looking at history this way, look through the lens of generations, was originally developed by a group of German historians in the early 20th century. But if you look at generational history, it seems to really fit American history especially well. Actually going all the way back to the founding generation, all the way back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and all those guys. For instance, in American history, we've got a group of people born around 1900 who come of age in the 1920s. And these are people who became known as the Lost Generation. And the Lost Generation very nicely describes the children of the early 20th century. The people who went off to fight and die in World War I, and they returned home only to find the Spanish flu in a country that largely ignored them. And the Lost Generation became very bitter and disillusioned. They drank heavily, they danced to jazz, they inhabited speakeasies, and they poured all of their creative energies into writing some of the greatest novels in American history. And the Lost Generation really did write some of the greatest novels in American history. And you've heard of some of the people of the Lost Generation. F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway's Movable Feast, Gertrude Stein's The Autobiography of Alice B. Takayas, Ezra Pound's incredible poetry. And in fact, it's from one of these books, from Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast, where he quotes Gertrude Stein, who looks at all of her friends who are basically bankrupt and borderline alcoholics, and they're writing these amazing novels and creating this amazing art. And Gertrude Stein looks at all of them and just says, "You are all a lost generation." And that's how Gertrude Stein kind of labeled this generation, these people coming of age after World War I, and very cynical and disillusioned. And much later, the concept gained considerable popularity, this concept of looking through history through the lens of generations. This gained considerable popularity with the publication of Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation, published in 1998, in which Brokaw argued that the World War II generation, born between 1901 and 1927, that these people represent the best of American society, the best of American history. They rebuilt the country from the Depression. They won the largest military conflict in world history. They righted the wrongs of Jim Crow. This was the argument made in Brokaw's book. And while Brokaw's book was criticized for being kind of mawkish and being kind of mythologizing, it did have some truth to it. I mean, these people did kind of save the world after all. So let's look at what a generation is. So a generation is people born during distinct years and collectively experiencing the historical events, the social customs, the popular culture of that time, and they share a set of attitudes and behaviors. You know, these are people who share ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and experiences. So we're going to talk about the boomers. Now, we generally group the boomers as being born between 1946 and 1964, but there is considerable wiggle room with those dates. And again, I want to stress that it's not just the time period in which you were born, but it's ideas and attitudes and beliefs and experiences. For instance, there are people that everyone just kind of assumes are quintessentially boomers who are not technically baby boomers. They were not born between 1946 and 1964. For instance, the Beatles. You know, John, Paul, George, and Ringo can't get any more baby boom than the Beatles, but technically none of them belong to the baby boom. They were all born in the early years of World War II. John, 1940, Paul, 42, George, 43, Ringo, 1940. Not technically boomers, but they really are boomers. They have the ideas, the attitudes, the beliefs, the experiences. We're going to meet a fellow, the high priest of acid, Timothy Leary himself, the quintessential hippie, the boomer, born 1920. All right, there he is with flowers in his hair at Haight-Ashbury. And the great hippie murder cult leader, Charles Manson, can't get more boomer than that. Not technically a boomer, born 1934. So it's not just the year of birth, it's ideas, attitudes, beliefs, and experiences. And the great guitarist himself, the greatest guitarist in America, one of the greatest guitarists in American history, Jimi Hendrix himself, technically not a boomer. The great writer of the baby boom, Hunter S. Thompson, born 1937, not technically a baby boomer, but they are baby boomers because they have the same ideas and attitudes and beliefs and experiences. And it works on the other side of that as well. There are people that were born in that window that we ascribe the baby boom who are not baby boomers. The kings of punk rock from the 1980s, Johnny Lydon, John Ritchie, Johnny Rotten, and Sid Vicious was their stage names. The Sex Pistols, punk rock. Now, punk rock was a complete and total rejection of the 1960s and 1970s counterculture. It was a rejection of everything the baby boomers stood for. But Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious were technically baby boomers, but they weren't. They did not share the same ideas or attitudes or beliefs or experiences. They rejected all of that. The great writer of Generation X, Bret Easton Ellis, technically a baby boomer, born 1964. But he does not share those ideas, those attitudes, those belief systems, or those experiences. In fact, it's hard to find a more anti-baby boomer book than American Psycho. All right? So the exact year of birth in which one is born is only a loose indicator of kind of what generation you're a member of. And to some extent, you get to kind of pick it. All right? And I also want to stress that there are a lot of baby boomers. I mean, there's a lot of them. All right? So while we are going to discuss these people like as a single group, we do need to discuss that there was a lot of variety inside this group. This group encompassed a wide range of ideas and attitudes and beliefs and experiences. Not everybody born between, World War II and 1964 was an oversexed, pot-smoking flower child. All right? Yet, within this group, there are a set of common memories, common experiences, common attitudes, and common ideas that do define this generation. So let's go ahead and define who the boomers actually are. Who are the boomers? Okay, the boomers are a generation of Americans, 76 million strong, mostly born between 1946 and 1964, during the baby boom, who share memories and experiences of growing up in the 1950s, the hippie flower power of the 1960s, the murder of John F. Kennedy, the fighting in Vietnam, the moon landings, the malaise of the disco 70s, the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, the Cold War, and the coming of the 21st century. Those are the baby boomers. And where did they come from? They got started with a magic carpet. All of this starts with the last major military operation of World War II, Operation Magic Carpet. Operation Magic Carpet was the rapid demobilization of the entire World War II military. President Truman authorized this rapid demobilization of 16 million Americans in uniform. The boys were coming home, and they pressed into service to get these boys home. They pressed into service everything the U.S. government had. Every ship, every plane, battleships, carriers, cruisers, tugs, destroyers, liberty ships, liners. Heck, I'm sure they threw in a rowboat or two. They packed all of these ships to the brim. The boys were coming home. 16 million of them. And the images from Operation Magic Carpet have to be seen to be believed. I mean, look at these things. They are bringing everybody home. Aircraft carriers packed with people. That is the hangar deck of an American aircraft carrier, where they basically pushed all the planes and all the guns and all the ammunition off to one side and filled it with cots. Everybody wanted to come home. There's a Liberty ship there on the upper left, packed to the brim with returning soldiers and sailors and airmen. And the motto of the day, scrawled on many ships, home alive by 45. And these men received a hero's welcome when they got here. Ticker tape parades, people hailing them as these are the soldiers and sailors who saved the world. There's General Eisenhower, 100,000 people screaming his name. They returned home as heroes and were greeted as heroes. And the very first thing they wanted to do was not even get out of their uniform. They wanted to get married. People got married in large numbers because they'd put off marriage for the years of the war because they didn't know who was coming home. And there are a lot of images of people getting married. In fact, if you look at that chart right up above my head, there was a massive spike in marriage certificates, and this is the largest percentage of married couples in American history, 1946 to 1952. Everybody got married. They didn't even have suits to wear. They generally just wore their uniforms. But the rapid demobilization of the United States created three significant problems: an economic crisis, a housing shortage, and a weak foreign policy. We're going to deal with the weak foreign policy later. We're just going to deal with the first two right now. One was obvious economic problems. 16 million men entered the job market looking for work all at once. This triggered unemployment. This triggered a sharp inflationary cycle. And this resulted in a pretty sharp economic recession in the late 1940s. President Truman, right up above me, really struggled with the weak American economy, and he never really was able to come to terms with all of the problems of the late 1940s. In fact, between these economic problems and the Korean War, that largely destroyed the presidency of Harry S. Truman. So one, there was a big economic problem right off the way. Second was a housing crisis. Quite simply, 16 million people came home, 16 million people got married, 16 million people wanted a home. And here's the problem. Okay, you've got millions of couples who wanted nothing more than to settle down. But the problem was there was no significant housing construction in America. There hadn't been significant housing construction in America since the 1920s. I mean, in the 1930s, nobody was building houses because there was a depression. In the 1940s, nobody was building houses because there was a war. So now we've got to the late 1940s, everyone wants a house, and there's no houses, all right? This was kind of addressed awkwardly in two ways. One way worked and one way did not. What didn't work was what happened in the big cities. The big cities of America decided to institute rent control, in which they would fix what landlords could charge for rent. And rent control proved to be a major failure, and it largely ruined the cities for couples trying to live there. And far more successful was the second solution to this housing crisis in the late 1940s. So much more successful was a new form of living, pioneered in a place called Levittown in Pennsylvania. And this new type of community was to be called the suburb. And that's what people wanted. They came home, they got married, they dreamed up what they were going to do, and they started building homes. And a lot of these guys had, a lot of money in back pay that was owed to them by the government. So they had money. They could make a down payment on a home. Veterans pay down only minimum closing costs. 3-bedroom house, only $7,900. People flocked to these new suburbs. And there is the first American suburb, Levittown, Pennsylvania. So what was a suburb? Now, suburbs were these whole neighborhoods with cheaply made, rapidly built, virtually identical houses built from prefabricated forms. Like Levittown itself, these suburbs surrounded the major cities and they centered on the car. You can't live in a suburb without a car. To live in a suburb, unlike living in one of the old American cities, one needed an automobile. So as these suburbs exploded across America, a result of the housing crisis of the 1940s, so did car ownership. And this is basically how it worked. Levittown was worked out like a mathematical problem. Veterans would show up. They would be escorted around this new planned suburb. They'd look around. Oh, I like that lot over there. Okay, I'll take lot number H34, and I would like house number 4. All right, complete price, $7,900, and it comes with a free television. And that's what they did. And again, a lot of these soldiers were owed back pay, so they could make their down payments there. All right. And I want you to kind of put yourself in their headspace for a second. To a generation that had grown up in the Great Depression, who had gone off to war, these houses just seemed like a dream come true. To own property, a 3-bedroom house, a car. This was the American dream. And that housing boom saved the American economy. Led by this housing boom, the U.S. economy rapidly recovered from the recession of 1949. And except for a few mild downturns, this launched a long period of economic prosperity and material influence in America. The U.S. economy boomed. It tripled in 15 years. In the 1950s and 60s, times were good. Unemployment averaged 4.5%, incredibly low. Wages were solid. Life was good. This was a long period of material prosperity in America. Now, part of this came from the fact that there was no real international economic competition. Europe looked like that, all right? Europe had been bombed flat in the war and would take years to slowly rebuild itself, although they were substantially aided by the United States through the Marshall Plan. But even as Europe rebuilt itself, the nations of Europe rebuilt themselves in very particular ways. They created these sort of quasi-socialist, if not socialist, economies because their goal wasn't economic prosperity. Their goal was social stability. When the nations of Europe rebuilt themselves, they specifically rebuilt their political and economic systems to prevent the type of social friction that had created World War II to begin with. But these new European economies were not very efficient, and they were never really competitive with the United States. Frankly, they still aren't. I mean, Italy is not a major competitor to the United States. Italy, France, Britain, these are not major economic competitors to the United States in the 21st century. So in the 1950s, in the 1960s, the world economy was the American economy. And the long economic boom of the 1950s and 60s fueled one of the more remarkable events in American history. Social mobility on a scale that had never been seen before and has not been seen since. Large numbers of working class Americans moved into the middle class to reshape the entire social structure of the United States. Here is the social structure of the United States created in the old Gilded Age. And this is what's going to happen in the 1950s. Large numbers of working class people are going to become middle class people. A new American social structure emerged from the 1950s and 60s. The United States became a majority middle class nation with all of the economic and social implications of that. The whole of the nation adopted middle class values, middle class attitudes, middle class tastes. So much so that even today, everyone kind of claims to be middle class, regardless of what they actually might be. A millionaire will say, oh, I'm middle class. A factory worker will shrug and go, I think I'm middle class, even though they're not. And I want you to think of the scale of this change. You had people who grew up in the 1930s, people who grew up like that, living out of a car, fleeing the Dust Bowl of Nebraska and Oklahoma, looking for a new life. So people who grew up with that picture on the left, 25, 30 years later, find themselves owning that. They went from almost nothing to a car, a 3-bedroom house, property, kids, all right? And many of these attitudes formed in the 1950s are in fact still with us today. To be prosperous in America is to own the trappings of a 1950s middle-class household. You own a house, you own property, you own a car, maybe two. You own a set of appliances, dishwashers, televisions, laundry machines. To be prosperous in America is to be middle class, to live a comfortable life in a nice neighborhood. And today, we view such prosperity and social mobility as something that is natural and something that is to be expected. But we forget that this was not normal in American history. The problem with this attitude is that in accepting that the 1950s represent some sort of norm in American society is to forget that the 1950s were a very unique period in American history, and one that we as a nation have internalized as normal, when in fact the 1950s and 1960s were a very exceptional time in American history. And times were good. People were comfortable. They were well fed. They could afford the latest fashions. They could buy the newest cars. And this really is the golden age of advertising as well. They have really great advertisements in the 1950s and 60s. Look at that one. But darling, they're staring at our new 52 Dodge. And I want to pause for a moment and talk about art. Okay, like the lost generation poured all of their artistic talent and effort into novels. As we'll see with the baby boomers, they pour all of this artistic energy into music. What did the greatest generation do? They took all of their artistic vision and energy and talent and decided that the thing they were going to make a new art form were cars. And you really can't fault these people. Oh my Lord. The 1950s and 60s are the most beautiful time where America made the most beautiful cars. Oh my Lord, look at those things. Look at that Thunderbird. Look. Oh my Lord. Give me a moment, please. Okay, moving right along. Okay. Now, but even then, with the affluence of the 1950s and 60s, this affluence was covering some very real problems in American society. And this was pointed out in John Kenneth Galbraith's Affluent Society, published 1958. Now, the main brunt of Galbraith's book is he builds this complex and somewhat silly argument that private wealth was creating public poverty. But that's not the part I really want to focus on here. I want to talk about the really interesting part of the book. The interesting part of Galbraith's book was his argument that the wealth and comfort of post-war America was merely papering over the problems of America. It was papering over the misery of the poor, the widespread inequalities of income, environmental pollution, social injustice. Galbraith argued that America should switch from a society focused on mindless private consumption to one of public community investment to help all Americans, not just the prosperous ones. So Galbraith argued that the material prosperity of the time is actually preventing the country from addressing its many problems. You know, one can ignore the racial bigotry of Jim Crow or the casual sexism and chauvinism against women or the deep traumas of the war or the repressive social conformity or the gross material inequality. One can ignore all of these problems if at the end of the day, you're comfortable and well fed and you come home to a nice house filled with cool stuff. And the 1950s had real problems. Don't forget, the 1950s had real problems. After all, halfway through the 1950s begins the great years of the civil rights struggle. You know, the King years themselves. Brown v. Board of Education comes in 1954. And this isn't just even talking about the racial stuff. We can talk about the casual sexism and chauvinism of the day, which was just openly expressed. There's a beer commercial. Oh, anyway, don't worry, honey. You didn't burn the Schlitz. And this brings me to this kind of existential question. And I kind of want you to ask yourself this for a second. Does comfort and wealth necessarily disguise deep-seated problems? Now, those are obviously not people from the 1950s, but this might be true today. And I want to ask you this. I'm interested in your thoughts on this subject. If one has good food and comfortable surroundings and cool stuff, does this make it easier to ignore problems? All right. And if you've got all this cool stuff, if you're comfortable, does this make it harder to address real problems? And if your material comfort and affluence allow you to ignore these problems, does that eventually make the problems worse? Is affluence a kind of curse? Because in the 1950s, America really did try to ignore its problems. And there were very real problems in post-war America. Not just talking about the sexism or racism of Jim Crow. For instance, there were very strong pressures for conformity. People who dressed and acted differently were socially punished. This society of the 1950s and 60s, this created an American society where people dressed alike, where people acted alike, where everybody wore the same gray business suit. I mean, look at these photographs from the 1950s. There's no facial hair, there's no mustaches, there's nary a beard to be seen. In fact, if you look at that picture, there's like maybe 8 types of neckties and 3 types of suits. And that's it. Everybody's wearing the same hat. Everybody's dressing the same. There were strong social pressures to conform. And to some extent, this was another artifact of the war. And some historians have referred to this generation as the militarized generation, where a lot of these men had simply spent so long in uniform that that's what made them comfortable. That's what they wanted. They just exchanged green army uniforms for gray business uniforms. And this is, in fact, the question posed during probably one of the best novels of the 1950s, Sloan Wilson's 1955 Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, where, it's almost Sloan Wilson's autobiography, where he's talking about, his comfort and this business world, and this conformity is like a straitjacket, and he kind of is trying to ignore the fact that he's got terrible PTSD from the war, and that he's basically a functioning alcoholic, and trying to break out of this conformist pressure that's preventing him from addressing these very real problems in his life. His alcoholism, his war trauma, his deteriorating marriage, his child that he's had with his mistress. It's a really good novel. And it's describing, I think, very well the kind of conformist pressures and underlying unhappiness of the 1950s. So people in the 1950s were aware of these things. They were aware of these issues. They were not wholly oblivious to the fact that the 1950s had big problems. And one indicator that the 1950s had big problems is everybody smoked and drank. All right. They drank a lot. They smoked a lot. The average adult in the 1950s consumed roughly twice as much alcohol as today. Roughly 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol per person per week. That's roughly a bottle of whiskey every 5 to 6 days. Average cigarette use, 38 cigarettes per person per week. That's about half a pack a day. All right. So these people smoked a lot and they drank a lot. And that wasn't all they did. This was in addition to regular use of prescription medications. From methamphetamines to benzodiazepine. All right. These people smoked, they drank, they popped pills. And a lot of people talk about the drug culture of the counterculture, the drug culture of the 1960s and 70s. But it should be pointed out that the drug culture started in the 1950s, all right? That doctors regularly prescribed really powerful medications. People would be depressed. People would be bored. Just take a pill. Take a little methamphetamine. That'll get you through the day. And here we have advertisements for, oh, good Lord, what is that? Rafamine phosphate for cheerfulness, mental alertness, and optimism. It's meth. They're prescribing meth to housewives. There's another type of methamphetamine, Dexamyl, where the man is talking to the doctor and says, I never thought I'd see the day where she's dieting and easy to live with, because you lose weight when you're on meth. All right. And women especially began to pop a lot of prescription medication because women found themselves really unhappy. Women found themselves really unhappy. And this caused a lot of consternation for these women. After all, they'd gotten everything they wanted in the 1930s and 40s. They had a home, they had a husband, they had a modern house. Yet women found themselves increasingly bored by getting everything they wanted. You know, the sort of domestic trap that we talk about for the 1950s housewives, again, it should be remembered, this was a domestic trap that women themselves built, all right? After all, 8 years ago, they might have been like welding Liberty ships together. 8 years ago, they might have been making artillery shells or flying planes across the South Pacific. And this is all there is now? Having a kitchen, serving your husbands, getting pregnant? Is this really what they wanted? To just cook and clean and have babies? Because they're going to have a lot of babies. Like so many babies. So many babies. All right? In fact, so many women are pregnant so often, there's actually fashion magazines all about maternity clothes. How to look fashionable while pregnant. The latest Paris fashions for pregnant women. And they wanted to look good when they were pregnant because they were going to be pregnant a lot. All right. Between 1946 and 1964, the average American woman would give birth 4 times. All right. Between 1946 and 1964, 76 million babies are going to be born. This is the baby boom. Now, exactly why they had so many children remains a subject of considerable debate. Maybe it reflected the overall economic prosperity. After all, women could stay at home and a single salary could afford a large family and a house and 2 cars. Maybe it was the fact that there was ineffective birth control. There wasn't much birth control, and the birth control that did exist was difficult to get. Maybe it was a strong pressure to conform. After all these other women were having babies, so you were expected to have babies too. Maybe it was the fact that women gained a lot of social status as motherhood. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was none of those things. The theory that I like the best, and I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but the one that seems most convincing to me is that this is again a product of the war. This was a real celebration of life. Everyone you see in those photographs right up above me, all of those people saw some heinous things in World War II. They saw death on a scale that you or I cannot imagine. All right? And so they came home, they got married, and they wanted to celebrate life. Maybe it was this celebration of life, a psychological reaction to the death and the horror of the World War. And this baby boom created a permanent bulge in American demography. You can see it right there, working its way through the decades of American history. This baby boom was gonna change America. By sheer numbers, the boomers were going to change the country. And they did. They grew up in these 1950s, 1960s households, and then proceeded to reject everything about their parents' lifestyle, rejecting everything about the middle-class affluence of the 1950s and 60s. But that's a story for another day, as we build an answer to that question on the left. Evaluate the historical legacy of the baby boomers. Were they social revolutionaries who remade a better, more equal, more liberated America, or spoiled, self-indulgent narcissists who ruined the prosperous country they inherited? Using the history described in these two perspectives, did the baby boomers save or squander the legacy of America? And that's what we're going to talk about next time. And I will see you there.